Okay, thank you very much, Akiva. I'll start with a little bit of a cryptocurrency marriage. On a rainy day in Palo Alto in March 2021, Rebecca and Peter Kaczerginski stood before friends, family, and a few dozen guests on Zoom as they exchanged wedding vows. COVID-19 accommodations aside, the ceremony was traditional. The bride wore a veil. The groom wore a kippah. Neither could stop smiling. Then things took a 2021 turn. Juggling her bouquet in one hand and an iPhone in the other, Rebecca opened a virtual wallet and sent Peter a non-fungible token or an NFT. He did the same. Using an Ethereum smart contract, Peter wrote himself, the couple exchanged unique digital signifiers containing a pink and blue animation called taba'at, which means ring in Hebrew. They weren't only getting married in the historic Gamble Garden or in the state of California, they were also getting married on the blockchain, a virtual ledger that displays cryptocurrency transactions. For the Kaczerginskis, the act was a reference to their jobs. Both work with Akiva at Coinbase, and a meaningful way to mint their union. Unlike their marriage certificate, which was contingent on government approval, their online relationship status, which Facebook could delete in a minute, or a paper ksuba, which could burn in a house fire, they personally control the NFT. Public, poignant, and permanent. It's the ultimate romantic gesture, in case anyone wanted to try that. In another aside, talking about marriage here, in February of 2018, an intriguing case came before a rabbinical court in Israel. A Sephardi couple, we'll call them Reuven and Rachel, had gotten married with a ketubah denominated in Bitcoin. In Judaism, a portion of marital vows is for the man to accept a monetary payment penalty called a ksuba in case of divorce, in addition to support or alimony. In other words, if the couple gets divorced, the man obligates himself to a financial penalty. That is called a ksuba. In Sephardic custom dictates that the amount of the ketubah is set by the standard of living and the social status of the groom. Being that Reuven and Rachel were both wealthy bankers, they had agreed on a 2 million shekel ketubah. In the past, the addition was often denominated in local commodities, say 50 camels or 5 talents of silver for a wealthy family. Being young and cool, the couple agreed to use 30 Bitcoin to represent the 2 millions. This occurs as Bitcoin is trading for approximately $19,000 a coin, and as is common with Bitcoin, and unfortunately sometimes with marriage, value changes. Right? and the couple approached the court a year later. Rachel wants the 2 millions. She's okay if she gets paid in Bitcoin. However, Reuven claims the document specifically denominates the ketubah in Bitcoins. 30 Bitcoin at the time are worth approximately 420,000 shekel. The rabbinical court needs to determine how much is owed. So as you can see, while Bitcoin is certainly not commonplace among halachic related questions, but it's certainly beginning to come on the radar screens of halachic decisors and what the Torah law would be to treat and how to treat the halachic status of Bitcoin. Two critical components in halachic terms that Akiva previously mentioned. One of them is that Bitcoin is decentralized and not issued by a government. No government controls Bitcoin. It is not recognized on legal tender. Backed by nobody, backed by no government. It's a consensus. With no one. The only country to recognize Bitcoin as legal tender is El Salvador. But other than that, by and large, it's not backed by any governmental authority. Second, Bitcoin is not tangible. There is no item called a Bitcoin. A Bitcoin is merely a positive balance within the public ledger. So now the first question would be, because Bitcoin is not tangible, would we say that it is fundamentally different from all forms of existing money? And just as halacha does not treat certain intangible items as having substantive existence, for example, intellectual property in halacha is much more limited than by secular law. Halacha recognizes a lot less value to intellectual property because there's no way to, it isn't a tangible component. So while there are halachic rules, the rules for intellectual property are substantially provide a substantially lower degree of ownership than of tangible property. So perhaps the first consideration to ask, would Torah consider an intangible currency to be of monetary significance in terms of halacha? The answer to that there seems to be wide consensus that it would certainly be the case that Torah does allow for an intangible currency to be recognized as value. There are many precedents for this. We have a concept called shava kesef, an item of value. This could be an item of value, a commodity that has a fixed marketplace, a liquid stock, a stock that has liquid markets that can easily be converted into dollars. And this could be things like secondhand furniture. And one is allowed to pay many different types of debt using shava kesef, using value. However, typically the conversion value typically favors the payee as opposed to the payer, because we want to allow the payee a margin to be able to convert his used furniture into cash at a favorable price and without undue effort. And therefore, it would be presumed that Bitcoin should be no different in terms of being an asset that's traded, it's recognized, it has a value that markets determine. It would seem to be in the quality of shava kesef. Moreover, a woman typically gets married by the acceptance of a ring, usually a gold ring. However, she's allowed to accept any item of value, including services. So, for example, a woman theoretically can tell her prospective groom, if you take my clothing to the cleaners with that benefit that you've provided to me, presuming it's quantifiable, let's say there's an Uber Eats for that or something, that would suffice to create a marital bond. And therefore, the presumption is that Bitcoin would certainly be considered shava kesef, at least a value. Now, there's a bigger question. Even if it is considered a value, is Bitcoin considered a commodity or a currency? The typical words used here is called tiva or kesef, which means a currency, or peri. Peri is a commodity. There are different halachic realms with regard to currency, with regard to commodity in a number of different areas. The most common one, or the most practicable in terms of Bitcoin, would be ribis. A Jew is prohibited to loan another Jew money with the requirement to pay interest. Jews are obligated by Torah law to either become partners in a potential business venture, in which case the profits can be split in whichever way the partnership is so devised, or to loan money interest-free. Biblically, according to biblical law, one is allowed to loan money. He's also allowed to loan merchandise. So I can loan you $10. I can loan you 10 pounds of apples or a ton of honey. Biblically, you have to pay back 10 pounds of apples, ton of honey, or whatever amount of money I've given you, or whatever merchandise. However, the rabbi said here there's a problem. If I loan currency, I loan you $100, you pay back $100. However, if I loan you a ton of honey, what might happen now is that the price of honey will increase dramatically. And by the time I'm paying you back a ton of honey, I'm actually providing you substantively more value than I borrowed. And this can be perceived as a possibility of ribis. And therefore, in general, there are some exceptions, but in general, the rabbis prohibited a loan of merchandise to be denominated in merchandise. The loan is either denominated in dollars, dollar value at the time, and it must be denominated in dollar value at the time of the loan and paid back either in dollars, currency, or in honey with the amount of value at the time of the loan. So if a ton of honey is worth $3,000, then you can eat, and the price of honey doubles, you have to pay like half a ton of honey, or $3,000. There are, I'm sorry?
What does the other guy do with the whole load of honey? Now he's making the profit.
Well, half ton of honey is worth $3,000.
Yeah.
Well, we consider all merchandise to actually be denominated in dollars. So we don't even view the loan as a loan of honey. It's actually he loaned you $3,000 worth of honey. There are some exceptions, but that's the general rule. This is very practically relevant to Bitcoin in terms of the decentralized finance world, or called DeFi, I'm not going to go into there. I guess Akiva didn't bring it up, so it's complicated. But basically, there are a number of methods to loan Bitcoin to liquidity providers, LPs, to provide yield farming, which is asset-based lending using Bitcoin, using third-party security services and complicated smart contracts. But this is all done decentralized without a single point of failure. So there's no government that can nullify these arrangements. And then there's other ways also to earn interest using cryptocurrency. Another one's called staking. Those are the most common versions. But if one loans money in Bitcoin, does he need to be paid back with the amount of Bitcoin he loaned or the dollar value of the Bitcoin at the time of the loan? There are some other practical differences between currency and commodity. We're short on time, so I'm going to skip those. But this is the one that's probably the most practical today. So now we have the critical question, obviously. To answer the question, we need to understand what is currency and what is a commodity. What defines the halacha of kesef, currency, and what determination will decide whether Bitcoin is excluded or included. Typical economists point out, as Akiva pointed out, the three typical functions of money are the medium of exchange or legal tender, the ability to tender cash in a payment transaction. The second one is a unit of account. Are things measured in Bitcoin? Are they measured in dollars? Are they measured in grams of silver? And the third is a store of value. A store of value means that if I'd like to carry power with me, denominated in currency value terms, then I carry money, currency with me from point A to point B. Interestingly, the Torah does recognize that third component as a component of currency. So one of the tithes, the agricultural tithes required, is called Ma'aser Sheni. Skipping the details, but the concept is that a certain percentage of the agricultural crop needs to be brought to Jerusalem every couple of years. Now, obviously, agricultural products are perishable. So how are you going to bring it to Jerusalem? There's also a logistical problem, right? You're going to have to call a logistics company to arrange, transportation. You have to build rails, bring in trucks. Jerusalem is not a port city. Not easy to bring things in by ship or barge. So the Torah says it's a simple solution. What you can do is you can redeem the value of the perishable agricultural product and put it onto a coin, store of value. Take the coins with you, carry them to Jerusalem, and you can use the store of value now to spend it and buy the food, which now is considered the equivalent of the tithe. What's interesting is that the Torah blesses Israel with many different blessings. Gold and silver are not among them. Other metals are. Eretz asher avoneha barzel, a land whose stones, whose rocks are iron, and from whose hills copper can be mined. Now, so the blessing of the land of Israel is with copper and iron, not with gold and silver. Is there something missing in Israel because Israel lacks gold and silver? Is that a flaw in the land of Israel? Says Namanides, Ramban, this is not a flaw. Because what's unique to currency is that it's called gufay mamon. That means currency is non-functional. There's nothing you could do with currency. The point of the currency is to store value. Israel is blessed with functional capacity. It's blessed with agricultural blessings. It's blessed with the vehicles to mine an agricultural product using iron and copper. It's not blessed with things that are functionless, with the sole purpose of serving as gufay mamon, as an essence of value. And therefore, that's not considered a flaw in the land of Israel. So again, over here, we have another point of perhaps Torah definition of what currency is. Currency is something whose entire purpose is not functional. It's not to do anything. It's just to store value. The main sugya, the main Talmudical discussion, where we find the definition of currency is in a parak in Bava Metzia called Hazov. The Mishnah reads in English, Hazov means gold. When one party takes possession of the gold coins through a kinyan called Mashicha, meaning they've collected the gold in one position and they've moved it, they've transported it. They don't have to actually move it from location to location, but they've displaced it from its previous state. That's an act of acquisition. And if one party takes possession of the gold coins that the other party was trying to sell to them, Then they acquire. So again, so I'm trying to buy from Akiva 10 pounds of gold. Akiva puts it on a dolly because it's just too heavy. And I pull the dolly. Then Akiva now owns my silver coins that I've piled up to pay. However, if Akiva takes my silver coins and picks them and moves them, I do not acquire the gold. Similarly, if I am exchanging copper with Akiva, Akiva is selling me 100 pounds of copper, and I'm going to pay him with a stack of dollar bills. Akiva pulls the dollar bills, nothing. If I change my mind, I can change my mind. If I pull the copper, however, there's no more changing minds. It's a valid transaction. The transaction is executed, and there is no turning back on it. What's the explanation? What's going on? So the concept here is as follows. The main acquisition that the rabbis decreed is through the acquiring of the item being sold. We'll call it the commodity, not the currency. When the currency is transacted, the sale is not executed. The sale only settles when the commodity is brought to bear in the act of acquisition. So when you acquire the commodity, then the currency that was served as payment is executed, and now that's settled, meaning I can no longer revoke the transaction. However, if you acquire the currency, then we say that does not suffice to execute the transaction. I can still change my mind. It's recommended that you don't. The Gemara recommends you not change your mind. It's not respectable, but technically, legally speaking, you're allowed to change your mind. Now, over here, we're talking about commodities. We have gold, silver, copper, right? What's the commodity? What's the currency? What is being used to acquire what? There's a barter taking place. Is there a currency here, or is there a barter exchange of commodities, or is there a currency exchange for a commodity? Is there a sale taking place? So the Gemara explains, because silver is the most commonly tendered vehicle of payment, i.e., all transactions are basically all done with silver coins. So therefore, silver serves as the currency. Gold is the commodity that's being acquired, and this is a sale. In terms of a sale, the acquisition of the commodity executes the contract, not the acquisition of the currency. Okay, so we have a reference here from the Gemara that the definition of a currency is something that's tendered. The medium of exchange, the fact that money is used to buy things. You give money to acquire an object. This would make it seem as if the determining factor in reaching the conclusion of whether Bitcoin would be a currency or whether it would be a commodity would be its transactability. How accepted is it as a medium of exchange, as a medium of transaction? How easy is it for me to use the claimed currency to purchase items in a sale? There's an interesting discussion in this beginning in the 17th, 18th century. Banknotes began to become very popular. There was a number of shortages of precious metals at the time, and bankers said a simple solution to the shortage of precious metals is to use currency. Use banknotes to represent precious metals. Original banknotes were called certificates. As a matter of fact, if you look at American currency, any currency printed before 1934, or some currency printed before 1964, you'll notice that there are many of the currencies say on silver certificates. And again, before 1934, before the Federal Reserve Act of 1933, there were only certificates. If you read a certificate, it says very clearly on the banknote, payable to the bearer on demand, $1 in silver at any United States government department. Which means that the question here now became, what is the status of a banknote? Original banknotes were all certificates. The existence of a Federal Reserve note, meaning, as Akiva pointed out, a currency by the fiat of the government, by government's authority and determination, not backed by any precious metal, only came into existence in the beginning of the 20th century, in America in 1934. Now, the halachic decisors at the time had this new question: what is a banknote? Is it currency, or is a banknote considered an IOU? Is it a contract? It's a contract between the governor and the bearer. It's a bearer's instrument. It's like a lottery ticket, right? Lottery ticket's worthless, even if it's the winning number. A lottery ticket's a bearer's instrument. It entitles the bearer to claim value at at the government agency that issues a lottery ticket, or at the government agency that issues the certificate claiming that there is a currency, there is actually precious metal behind it. So the consensus of the Paiskim was that it is considered a currency, but there was a dispute why. And this dispute is crucial to understand. The Chassam Sofer says the reason why it's a currency is because the government says it's a currency. The government says it's a currency, it's a currency. It's a very interesting point. That means that he determines the transactability of the currency being the crucial component of that Gemara and government siyah is because the government so decrees. It's the government's decree that decides what is considered a currency, and that therefore it's transactable. However, Rav Moshe Teitelbaum, who was the contemporary of the Chassam Sofer, and later on the Chazon Ish, was a scholar of the 20th century, lived in Israel. They argued that no, the reason why banknotes are currency is because they're widely transacted, not because the government declared it to be a legal tender, but because they're used for legal tender. And we'll soon explore this might have very practical ramifications in determining whether Bitcoin is a currency or whether Bitcoin is a commodity. Now, there were Paiskim that said that it actually is a shtar. A certificate is just a representation of it's a bearer's instrument. It's considered a government issuing an IOU to the bearer. So the government issues IOUs. We owe you a certain amount of silver or gold that we have in our vaults, and you can go redeem it if you present a certificate. Now, it's interesting to note that all currency was backed by precious metals until, as Akiva pointed out, the unpegging of what they call the Bretton Woods system in 1971. So the Bretton Woods system was a system that pegged all currencies to gold. And the pegging system allowed currencies to adjust the peg, but it all had to be related to the commodity price of gold. In 1971, the US dollar was the first currency, not the first, but the first major currency to disconnect the peg. They unpegged it. And now the currency was free floating with other currencies and independently of the price of gold. By 1973, almost all nations in the world had depegged their currency, and almost all currency today, the Swiss dollar was slightly backed by, it was unpegged in 1973 as well, but there was some backing of gold until I think it was 2009 when they completely dissolved the peg. And there was no backing at all whatsoever, even on Swiss francs. Now, the question is if modern banknotes that are Federal Reserve would be considered kesef or shtar. Now, it's certainly not a shtar because there's no IOU anymore. The government doesn't claim to have any money. The government just decrees this to be $20, not that there's any backing of precious metals. And therefore, according to the Chassam Sofer and the Chazon Ish, they're both considered currency, whether it's a certificate or whether it is a Federal Reserve note. It's a fiat currency. But according to other opinions, there may be a difference, and it may be that we'd have to figure out a new reason for why Federal Reserve notes are considered a currency. Now, the Chassam Sofer makes this bold claim. He says that the government is what determines currency. Well, where did he get it from? Right? Can't make it up yourself. Where does it say? Where is there a reference to that? It's interesting. The Rambam discusses the laws of taxes, and under many conditions, the king is fully entitled to collect taxes. At a certain point, if the taxes become too excessive, then we consider the king to be a thief. If he's a thief, you're not obligated to follow the tax codes. What determines? Now, how do you know if the king is even a king? Maybe if you have a dictator, maybe the king is actually a thief, and there's no obligation to follow any of his rules. How do we know what defines a king? How do we know what defines a thief that's in power, a dictator, an authoritarian? So very interestingly, what does the Rambam give as a definition? A king whose currency is accepted. If a king has a currency that's accepted, then he's a king. He has the authority, he can collect taxes, you're obligated to follow his laws. And not only that, but his determination of what is legal, what is illegal, who owns what, and the justice system that he appoints to determine who owns what, they're fully enforceable, and they actually have halakhic standing. If, however, we have a king whose currency is not accepted by the population, and people do not respect the currency, the coinage he's issued, in that case, he's a thief. And there's no obligation to follow anything he says, nor is any of his judicial decisions with regard to ownership have any validity. So now that doesn't really change the question. The question, of course, is going to be, where did the Rambam get it? Right? Where did the Rambam find this in Talmud? But it is a strong support for Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer's claim that the government's decision determines what is currency can be strongly supported by Rambam. So in Talmud Yerushalmi, in Masechtas Meiser Sheni, we learn that a matbea shemorad, a rebellious coinage, cannot be used to redeem the Meiser Sheni, the tithe. What's an example of this? The coinage of Bar Koziba, Ben Koziba. In English, we typically call him Bar Kochva. Bar Kochva was a rebellious Jewish leader. There was a possibility he would even be the Messiah. Ultimately, he wasn't the Messiah. But he issued his coinage. As a matter of fact, much of his coinage is actually extant. You can go to coin collectors and they can show you Bar Kochva coinage. And the Talmud rules that Bar Kochva coinage is invalid. Now, here's the question. Was Bar Kochva coinage transactable? Presumably it was, right? Because he was the rebellious king at the time. The Jews were supporting him, so presumably you could do transactions with him. So why is it considered invalid? Because he was a rebel. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a king. So the government didn't give him legal authority. It's not a governmental issued currency, so it does not have the status of a currency. This would seem to be a proof for the Chassam Sofer that the government determines what is a currency. However, in Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, when that same Gemara is quoted, there's a catch. The Gemara quotes it in a different context. The Gemara says, the Gemara puts the coinage of Bar Koziba in the same category of coinage that was canceled, a currency that was canceled by the king, meaning a currency that isn't transactable. So according to Talmud Bavli, it's the reason why Bar Kochva's coinage was invalid for Meiser Sheni was because it wasn't used, because it wasn't a measurement, it wasn't a unit of exchange. Whether that's the reason of Talmud Yerushalmi, we won't know. But it's certainly the case that Talmud Bavli fails to support the notion of the Chassam Sofer. And now we can get into try to understanding, so what's the fundamental debate between the Chassam Sofer and the Chazon Ish? Is currency by governmental fiat? In other words, the government declaring a currency to be legal tender, or is currency because it is legal tender? Not because it's legal, because it's tendered, because it's used. So perhaps, even if there is a support for the Chassam Sofer, that a government decree of a currency's validity is necessary to determine whether it's a currency, perhaps we could argue as follows. Perhaps the debate between the Chassam Sofer and Chazon Ish revolves as follows. Does the government cause it? Is it causative? Is it the government's determination that makes it tender, that makes it the status of currency? And the fact that it's tendered is only the logical outcome of the government declaring a currency legal, or is that just a signpost? Typically speaking, usually if a government declares it legal tender, that would be a sign that it's transactable. So if I wanted to indicate to you that a specific currency was a valid currency, I would tell you, look, the government supports it, but not that it's the determining factor. Is it causative or is it indicative? In Hebrew, in Talmud, we would call this, is it a siba or is it a siman? Is the cause of the definition of currency the governmental authority, or will we say no? We say no, it's a siman. It's just an indication that this is a transactable currency. And that seems to be the debate between the Chazon Ish and the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer says it's causative. The government's decree causes something to be a valid currency, whereas the Chazon Ish says no. If you could prove to me that something the government decreed something to be a currency, then I presume it's transactable. And if it's transactable, it's a currency. It's only an indication. I believe there are two practical ramifications of this. El Salvador was mentioned as a country where Bitcoin is now legal tender, which means merchants are forced to accept it. However, if you've been reading the close headlines, you'll know that merchants hate it. It's too volatile. They can't deal with it. They don't want it. Merchants don't want to accept Bitcoin. So according to the Chassam Sofer, if Bitcoin is legal tender, so we perhaps can argue that even though it isn't issued by the government, but because the government decrees it to be a unit of exchange, so then we would say that Bitcoin in El Salvador might have the status of kesef, of currency. However, according to the Chazon Ish, it would be the opposite. We'd say that, no, nobody's using it. The merchants don't want to take it. They're not interested in it. So if they're not taking it, it's not a currency. It has the status of a commodity. And the difference obviously would be if you loan your fellow Jew in El Salvador a Bitcoin, does he have to pay? Is he allowed to pay you back in a Bitcoin? Or does he have to pay you back in El Salvadorian pesos, whatever, or US dollars, whatever the accepted currency in reality truly is. Conversely, let's imagine, maybe perhaps to the consternation of some of the more conservative folks here, that Bitcoin would become an internationally accepted means of payments, a medium of exchange. According to the Chazon Ish, then Bitcoin would be considered a currency, and Bitcoin would be allowed to be used. If you loaned the Jew money in Bitcoin, you'd be allowed to pay it back in Bitcoin. However, according to Chassam Sofer, that this is merely by custom and not by governmental fiat, that according to Chassam Sofer, this would not be a currency. It actually would be a commodity. And therefore, if in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, whatever it is, according to Chassam Sofer, you would not be able to pay back your fellow Jew in units of Bitcoin for a loan. Practically, as you might have probably figured out by now, practically speaking today, Bitcoin is certainly a commodity. It's certainly not a currency. And the halacha certainly today is to treat it as a commodity. And that indeed is the consensus of most of the poskim. I hope that was interesting and intriguing. Commodity is called payri. It doesn't mean commodity. It can mean.
Does that be usable physically?
No, used furniture is considered a commodity. This, in our context, used furniture would be considered a commodity.
But that's usable. You actually.
It could be
0 and a 1.
It's any commodity means really in this context meant anything of value. Anything whose value could be determined in some sort of objective, agreed upon process.
I was wondering if you were going to return to your first two.
Yeah. I've looked for the Bitcoin divorce. It seemed to be the crux of the matter. Seemed to be as follows. They agreed on 2 million shekel, and she claims that when she agreed to 30 Bitcoin, she just meant it as a cool placeholder because she's cool. And he says, well, look at the document. It says in the document 30 Bitcoin. And I looked in the Rabbanut archives. All the Rabbanut rulings are public. I couldn't find it. I looked for it, couldn't find it. It could also be because my Hebrew skills aren't that great that I couldn't find it, but I couldn't find it. From my conversations of experts that deal in the field of Jewish monetary law, the consensus seems to be that he'd be right, because at the end of the day, what it says in the contract is 30 Bitcoin. And that's it. If it says in the contract 30 Bitcoin, it's going to be 30 Bitcoin. She might have made a mistake and she might have done something stupid, but unless there's going to be a solid amount of substantiation to that claim that she made, that really the 30 Bitcoin was just a placeholder, he has the upper hand.
They had problems last There's something about this construction that just does not seem right to spread out.
Okay. Yeah, the other case is just a cute story of someone doing it. So you can send a woman Bitcoin for an engagement. You can marry a woman through Bitcoin, just like a woman can agree to accept your Uber Eats service, or car service to be equivalent of a diamond ring. It's her choice. Yeah, exactly.
Can I come back to the question of the honey? You used
Sure.
the example of the honey. So the two of us agree that I'm gonna loan you some honey, then the price of the honey goes up and it doubles, so therefore I'm only gonna return to you half of the honey,
Correct.
and you're settled. What am I
Correct.
supposed to do with the rest of the honey? That I still have that value. I still have
It's
that
your,
3,000.
so we can see it's yours. Well, we don't consider it to be a loan of honey. That's the distinction. The rabbis basically decreed. Now, again, biblically, you can loan honey and you can pay back an equal amount of honey, but because it can look like interest, because the value of the honey is, let's say it was gasoline, right? To make a real practical example, if I borrowed a gas tank from you a year ago and I pay you a gas tank now, I'm giving you substantially more value, right? So the rabbis, it looks like interest, right? It does. So therefore, the rabbi said there's no such thing. You denominate everything in currency. Even commodities are denominated in currency. There are a few ways around this.
But we're okay with the fact that I'm now sitting with this $3,000 worth of honey, which I've done.
So the answer is that we don't really consider it.
Basically, you just gave me a futures contract, is what you did, and I won.
That's indeed.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
It's
As
interesting.
long as you know the rules ahead of time, then it should be fine, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, but remember, it could have gone the other way.
Now,
yeah, it could have gone the
there-
other way.
there
I
are-
had enough
there
value
are
to
ways-
remember.
There are ways around this. If you loan like 1 gallon of gas,
Mhm.
then you can pay back like a small amount, like a loaf of bread, a gallon of gas, a dozen eggs. You know, that would be fine. Or if you loan something whose price doesn't change, commodity that's always the same cost. I'm not sure of a good example of that today.
Well, the government.
Yeah, I guess so. If the government, right, that would be a good example. The government regulated price that isn't inflation adjusted. There is one other way to do it, which is done sometimes practically for really large amounts where this is necessary. If you own a substantial amount of the same item, so if I borrow a ton of honey from you and I actually own 300 pounds of honey, and the rabbi said that this just looks like a barter. So then it's in that situation, that would be permitted. I don't want to go through that. There wasn't. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Akiva. Appreciate it. Took away a lot of the work.